Welcome to the Forrester and Baramundi conversation. The future is not what it used to be. There's a quote from Karl Valentin, a German, well actually a Bavarian comedian, singer and actor. And I'm sure that for all of you, the current situation is not what it used to be 2 years ago. We're living in changing times. We're living in times of compressed, condensed transformation. It all affects the way we work, the tools we use, the infrastructure that we have access to. So we would like to discuss today the changes of the roles of the IT administrator, the IT pro and the IT manager in these challenging times. I'm more than happy to have a guest with me. It's Andrew Hewitt from Forrester. Welcome, Andrew, to Augsburg, to Baramundi, to the software factory.
Speaking of a world that is fundamentally different, this is my first international business travel since before the pandemic, and I have to say I couldn't be happier to be in Bavaria talking about such an important topic. So thanks for having me.
Well, it's great. Andrew Hewitt is Senior Analyst with Forrester. His research area is in the field of infrastructure and operations. Well, his real focus is all around the digital workplace, and that includes EUEM, End User Experience Management, as well as Unified Endpoint Management, UEM. Is that all that you do?
Yes, so I have a fairly wide coverage area at Forrester, but what I like to say is that I help companies improve the technology experience of their workforce to drive higher levels of employee engagement. Now, that's a broad topic and it has a lot of different technologies, but the ones that I specifically focus on are exactly the ones you've mentioned around end-user computing, endpoint management, experience management, but I also do quite a bit of work on remote work research as well as return to office research and kind of smart office technology. So really everything that I look at is that comprehensive experience from a technology perspective and how organizations can use that to improve employee engagement.
So we're very great to have you. I'm Lars Lippert. I'm the Managing Director of Baramundi. So Andrew, what is your take about the changes that we see in the world and how is that reflected in IT? What has changed in IT?
It's a great question. And as you know, this whole transition to remote work has fundamentally changed life as we know it, but also for businesses and IT administrators out there. Our most recent research indicated that 51% of organizations are going to pursue a hybrid work model. Another 15% are going to pursue full-time anywhere work, with the remainder percentage kind of going back to the way things were. But that full shift, almost 70% of organizations out there today, moving to some form of hybrid or remote work is going to have a lot of ramifications for IT administrators in terms of how they deliver technology, what types of technology choices they make, how they budget for that. And so it's going to have a lot of ramifications in that realm as well. And I'm sure that you've probably seen that as well amongst the Baramundi customers.
Yeah, definitely. But I like very much the way you address your points because you're using numbers. And as we are in Germany, we like numbers. I also have to add some numbers to that. There was a new research from the KfW, Kriterienanstalt für Wiederaufbau. It's a state-owned bank. And they found out that in the mid-market segment in Germany, there were 35% more investments in digitalization in IT, whereas only 5% decreased their investments. The overall investments in Germany for mid-sized companies was 16%. So I have also my numbers ready for that. But besides this, do you see any other effects?
Yeah, there's a few. And one of the major ones that we've started to see is organizations really returning to the basics. That full shift towards pandemic level, remote management forced a lot of IT organizations to say, hey, actually, we don't really have the tools and processes in place to make this happen. Right. I can give you one really good example of one customer that we were working with. And at Forrester, we work with a lot of enterprise customers. We hear all sorts of different types of stories. One of the ones that really sticks out for me is an example of an organization in which they had no way to remotely authenticate to their services when they sent people home. So they ended up buying thousands of hardware tokens to enable authentication in that first move to remote work. So an example of not having the basics to support remote work, really having some drastic consequences for that organization. But what we've seen as a result is that a lot of IT administrators have kind of gotten back to that basic mentality. What does my patch management process look like? Do I have full visibility over the devices that are connecting to my network? Do I have good confidence that I'm able to deploy endpoints to remote workers? Can I support them and troubleshoot their experience when they are working remotely? So it has forced people to say, I'm not going to have necessarily a dependency on things like domain joining PCs or pushing updates out through a VPN. I really need to start rethinking that overall strategy for my organization. I would also say that because of this massive shift, and it took a lot of effort. There were IT heroics. I'm sure you saw it in your customer base too. I had a lot of customers early days in the pandemic. We worked 72 hours over the weekend, right, packing boxes, shipping it out to the remote workforce, right? A lot of manual effort. And so the role of automation has come increasingly to the fore as well. People saying, I can't spend so much time manually deploying devices, doing troubleshooting, root cause analysis. I need to have some level of automation, low-code orchestration to enable me to actually do this very quickly and at scale, for a large remote workforce. So automation has been the other major, trend in the space. Two other ones which are really important as well have been, experience as a key trend. As organizations have said, I'm going to support a remote workforce. A lot of the IT pros I'm working with today are also asking, is what I'm doing actually providing a good experience? Or is it frustrating people? Does it take too long to deploy devices? Are patches getting in the way of people being successful at work, right? So experience is another piece. And the final one is really more knowledge around security and linking that into your IT operations. So there's been a huge impact on the way that IT admins are really looking at endpoint management. And it really comes down to kind of those four major pieces of remote work support, greater automation, greater awareness of experience, and greater awareness of security as well.
Right, and that whole thing in the context of speed. I mean, what we see from our customers, what we hear from our customers is the demand for, give me the solution fast. Yeah. So before the pandemic, the IT departments were used to multi-year projects. Mm-hmm. Even the approval phase took months. Now, these days, we're talking about projects that are, in the month or even week period of time. So the demand for quick solutions is much higher than before. And you mentioned also the diversity of endpoints and work styles. They all have to be brought together in a consistent way, in a unified way. And lastly, what we see is more pressure on the IT. And this pressure comes from, two sides. You mentioned also there are more investments in IT, but they have to deliver these projects with the same staff. Mm-hmm. So in terms of the upper management, these guys typically demand to change the IT infrastructure as fast as they have changed their PowerPoint slides. But also there is a demand from the employee side. Their experience should be similar or identical to the experience that they have in office. And even worse, they may expect the experience that they have from their public or their private PC that they have at home in terms of software installation, security, blah, 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 also for their working PC that is next to their private PC at home. So these are challenges. This is more pressure. This is more diversity. And finally, it's all about timing and timing pressure. So when we look at the role of the IT pros, the IT managers and the administrators, do you see how this impacts also their role currently?
So what we've been talking about a lot has been a transition. The way I like to describe it is engineer to orchestrator. For a long period of time, IT administrators have been extremely technical, people that could write all these custom PowerShell scripts, all sorts of, kind of tribal knowledge that's been built up over the years, right, and very technical in nature. And that was really good if you were a company that was deploying 100% Windows, maybe, kind of in a traditional manner, not using a lot of modern endpoint management techniques. But the problem with that is it's not scalable. And so you have this issue, like you've said, where there's more complexity, more OSs, different user demands, you have different pressures from the business to work fast. That traditional model, although people, a lot of folks love to work in that model, they love that technical nature, isn't necessarily what's best for business. So if you're going to move to really support the business in a very scalable fashion, you need to stop thinking like an engineer and more of an orchestrator, someone that can deploy policies across multiple OSs through a single function within a unified endpoint management console. That's going to be using low-code policy building tools to be able to deploy these capabilities very quickly across thousands and thousands of endpoints, right? It's going to require an abstraction of kind of those technical skills to a higher level. And so the major trend that we are seeing is a move away from being super technical to being a much higher level orchestrator across the entire environment.
So I really like your aspect of the evolution from an engineer to an orchestrator. I mean, this is absolutely in line with what we see from our mid-sized customers. There's, of course, the need to abstract, and you mentioned that already, to get out of the nitty-gritty details up to a higher level, where you have the overview of all the projects that currently are active or relevant. Talking about relevance, this is the second part that we experience that the administrators, IT pros have to learn, to prioritize, to really see through the jungle of different projects that are highly relevant, obviously, for the company, to identify those that are urgent. So to have that prioritization helps you then to segment all these funny things that you have to do day by day, according to these that are doable, that are potentially doable, and that are not on your radar screen anymore. And as you mentioned, you have to have the empathy then to communicate that. And this is the third aspect that is relevant for an administrator. You have to communicate why this is relevant, or why this is urgent, why this is on your priority list or not. And these are very tough discussions typically, because then you have to identify those projects that you cannot deliver. And the fourth point, you're absolutely on track, is automation. How can you get rid of the day-to-day business stuff? How can you find patterns that you can delegate to a unified endpoint management system, for instance, like the Baramundi management suite, so you can do more with potentially less?
Yes.
Talking about UEM, how does a UEM, a unified endpoint management system, support the administrator, IT pro, IT manager in these times?
Definitely a lot of key ways, and I just wanted to quickly harp on your point as well around the empathy piece. That's a huge transition too. It's, obviously the technology plays a huge role, but another piece of this is that IT admins need to become more user-centric, need to understand what those user needs are, and develop a lot more people-centric skills, right? So I think that that's a really important point that surely I think is something that the audience should take away, is like, you need to be much more business-centric when it comes to endpoint management. To your question, though, on unified endpoint management and how that supports that administrative role, a couple of key areas today. So the fundamental value proposition around unified endpoint management has always been multi-OS support. That's where it started, right? We kind of started with MDM, was very focused on iOS and Android, extended out to EMM, which brought in different types of applications, and then unified endpoint management was a way of saying, can I manage all of these operating systems that are kind of traditional in focus, whether that's Windows, Mac, iOS, or Android. Chrome OS is more frequent these days as well. Can I manage those through a single platform? And the answer is yes, but you can't manage each platform the way that you would have with a single tool, right? You're going to need to be able to deploy policies across all of those different operating systems. One key example I've seen with a lot of our customers is doing things like setting and verifying encryption levels. Like, there's really not a huge reason why you should have to go to different platforms to set encryption across different operating systems. But if I could do that through a single platform, ensure that I'm secure and I have the basics in place, that's where you're talking about moving much more at scale rather than diving into each one of these individual platforms. The other two major pieces. One is around automation, and specifically what we're starting to see here is a focus on automation of different parts of the endpoint lifecycle. So the classic one is things like Windows Autopilot or Zero Touch, or Apple, Business Manager, right? Being able to leverage the underlying operating system deployment technologies. And so we've seen a lot of organizations take advantage of those within UEM platforms. So UEM is going to be really good at bringing in those workflows and allowing people to actually go and utilize them in the business. So a lot of automation in that upfront piece. The bigger transition, however, is usage of low-code orchestration within the platform itself. So can I, let's say, set a policy that may be multivariable? Maybe I want to look across multiple different characteristics of an endpoint and be able to enforce remediation across many endpoints at once, right? And so the ability to configure that within UEM platform is increasingly a really important part of the market itself. The final area here is having capabilities that are very suited for a remote, hybrid, anywhere workforce, whatever you want to call it. So, traditional endpoint management, right, would require, things like pushing out patches via VPN or, not being able to use the internet for kind of like modern management, right? And so a lot of organizations are looking at, can I deploy those patches in a remote hybrid setting, particularly with third-party patches. They tend to be a huge issue. But being kind of anywhere first or remote first with your UEM platform is really going to help you do that at scale and not really require you to have so much manual effort when it comes to supporting that remote workforce.
Right. Just a short story, because a friend of mine just bought an e-bike. I think e-bike is an English word.
It is.
Okay, he bought an e-mountain bike, and he's super sportive. He's tough and big. So I was wondering why he's buying an e-bike, because typically I thought elderly people buy stuff like this.
Fair.
But it turned out that he bought this because he can achieve more with his e-bike right now. He's as exhausted with his new e-bike as he is with his old bike, but he sees more, he can make more miles. Why is that relevant? Well, let's transfer that in the UEM space. It's very much what you said. It is automation. A new tool should help you to automate stuff, to make it easier. Low code, like our automation studio, helps you to be more productive, to bring more together and ease your life and have more fun, like an e-mountain bike. There's a second aspect to that. It's self-service. We think that an administrator can relieve some efforts if he puts responsibility into the hands of the end user. So having a great kiosk and all the capabilities that you typically have to do as an administrator and give that into the hands of the end user helps you to ease your life. You also mentioned the aspect of security, and this is very relevant for us too. We have integrated vulnerability scans, a deep integration into Microsoft Defender in a unified endpoint management system in the Baramundi management suite. So bringing these two worlds together, management and security, and have that in a consistent UI is super key for us and is an advantage that we actually bring to the table. And lastly, you mentioned also the hybrid world, the totally different approaches to manage potentially a mobile device and a PC. For us, unified endpoint management means that we bring this usability, this concept of unified endpoint management real together and bring that to life. So the Baramundi Management Suite is built on that paradigm to really ease the life of the administrator and to make it more fun at the end of the day. Talking about fun and endpoints, do you think that Windows 11 as a new endpoint brings added value to the administrators?
Well, it's another endpoint that people are going to have to manage, right? As they think about their strategy for management and security, having the most up-to-date operating systems is obviously going to be, very important. But it's not really, the only type of operating system or endpoint that people are going to be managing. And luckily, it does rely on a lot of the same frameworks and processes and mechanisms underneath that make it very similar to managing a Windows 10, operating system. But it's another piece of complexity that people are going to have to deal with, in addition to dealing with all sorts of different types of operating systems. We actually recently pulled our data on this, and a vast majority of employees actually indicate they use more than 2 operating systems in a given week. It's upwards of 80% of people are using 2 different types of operating systems. And so when you think about that level of a complexity continuing to rise, that's where things like unified endpoint management really start to come in handy, where I, as an IT administrator, can say, yes, I can enable you, I can allow you to have that choice. At the same time, it doesn't have to be overwhelming for me to support that, or for our organization, very costly to support that. And so that's the fundamental value proposition, in my view, of why a modern unified endpoint management platform, it becomes increasingly relevant, because it's not just Windows 11, it's going to be all sorts of other operating systems, known and unknown, coming down the pipeline that we have no idea of today. And so that has consistently grown over the years.
Right. And we also see that the number of IoT devices in offices is dramatically growing. So there's a challenge for the administrator. What are the devices and how can they manage it? So the baramundi Management Suite is definitely focused also on these devices, on these new types of endpoints, above and besides, of course, Windows 11. So we're talking about sensors and actors, specifically in the production facility environment. So one of our strategies is also to extend the reach of the baramundi Management Suite to production security, to OT devices, and to make them manageable, to make them usable in a consistent way, similar to the experience that you have by managing mobile devices, PCs, and so on and so forth. Coming to the market overall, Forrester has just released a great document, a great research, the Forrester-Wafe about UEM. Can you elaborate a little bit on that, please?
Sure, absolutely. So, as I mentioned earlier, I've been covering the UEM space for quite some time. I've seen it develop from MDM, EMM into UEM. And this was actually our second rendition of the Unified Endpoint Management Wave. We did our first one in 2019 and our second one at the end of 2021. And for those that are watching that aren't aware of the Forrester-Wave, it is essentially our evaluative research product, where we go into a particular market and evaluate all the top providers in that space, and then score them and then place them on an overall graphic. And so it helps our clients kind of figure out what types of technologies they want to invest in, what are the pros and cons of each vendor. And for this particular wave, we included insights on 11 vendors, and we scored them across 30 or so criteria, spread across different areas like experience and management and security and strategy overall. And so really in-depth process as well. What we require, from our evaluations is pretty substantial. You are part of the process as well, so I'm sure you can attest to that. But it requires a demo and briefing, usually a few hours in length, talking to 3 customer references across all of the vendors, as well as an in-depth questionnaire. So a rigorous research process that we go through to score these vendors and really try to tease out what are the differentiators and what are the differences between each of the vendors that we evaluate. So 11 vendors in this past year, and what really stood out to me were basically 3 major trends that we're seeing kind of consistently across all of the vendors in the space. One was a consistent focus on helping people modernize endpoint management with modern practices like I mentioned earlier, like deployment automation, low-code orchestration, those types of things. As well as support for all the kind of modern management frameworks from the OEM providers. So we're continuing to see a lot of momentum there, and actually a lot of interest from customers on that piece as well. Security, integration, and consolidation was another major area. We're seeing a lot of integration of, let's say, vulnerability management, like you mentioned earlier, EDR capabilities, mobile threat detection, all sorts of different kind of endpoint security focused functions as being critical capabilities in the UEM market itself. And then the final capability is around experience and how can you deliver that. And so UEM plays a really important role in terms of delivering and setting up that foundational experience. I get a device, I can enroll it, someone can go to work. Like how easy that is can really impact their overall experience. So that's one piece of it, but another component of it is increasing focus on end user experience management, which is another market that I also cover, but which is being integrated into the broader UEM technology stack. So it involves collecting telemetry data, scoring the experience, et cetera, and helping people realize, okay, what is the impact of my endpoint management strategy and process on the overall end user experience. So again, it's kind of back to that remote hybrid work enablement, just getting more visibility on how well we're doing.
Right. I mean, we're very proud that obviously Forrester has seen us as one of the top 11 UEM vendors of the world. And it's great to quote now Forrester, overall baramundi software has a unique approach to PC management that enables it to deploy updates, packages and patches to both domain joined and over-the-air remote endpoints from a single workflow. End of quote. Great. Needless to mention that we can also manage Mac devices, iOS and Android, by the way. But for us, it was very interesting to see that you reflect in your report the value that we bring to the customers. I mean, they're highly satisfied. Our NSAT right now is 72, which is, I think, pretty good. And you mentioned that Baramundi software net promoter score remain among the highest in this evaluation. So yes, we have customers, we are growing, and they're satisfied. It was great to read that in your report. Thank you for that, and looking forward for the next one. Right now we're a contender, and I'm very positive that next time we might be even higher in that role.
I'm looking forward to the next one as well.
You mentioned a couple of times EUEM, End User Experience Management, and I absolutely agree. The value that the administrator brings, he or she brings to the end user at the end of the day. And it's super interesting, relevant how that impacts the work of the end user. Could you elaborate a little bit on your view around end user experience management?
Yeah, sure. So aside from being a very confusing acronym that sounds a lot like UEM, it is a completely separate market, but we are starting to see them as adjacent and sometimes better integrating across both of them. But here's how I would describe the difference. Unified Endpoint Management, UEM, is mostly about deploying devices, patching them, keeping them up to date, deploying applications. It's sort of like the endpoint management lifecycle is controlled by the Unified Endpoint Management suites. End User Experience Management, or EUEM, is really about collecting telemetry data directly from the endpoint, from the perspective of the end user. So the way that it works today is an agent gets deployed to the device. This could be a UEM agent, it could be a separate agent, depending, if the UEM supports that. But basically it collects a lot of that telemetry around the user experience, maybe things like CPU performance or application crashes or network latency, right? And it starts to benchmark all of those things together and provide an overall score visibility into what the health of that end user experience actually is. And so a lot of organizations are really interested in collecting this data so that they can use that benchmark to figure out, where do I need to invest in? What are the issues that are causing disruptions to my workforce? At the end of the day, if someone is running into an issue where they're getting a blue screen of death every day on their Windows device or something, that's really going to impact their productivity, and it's going to have trickle-down effects on their overall employee engagement as well. And so a lot of folks see end user experience management as a way to provide a much more stable technology experience for people. And so there are a handful of other capabilities in there too around remediation, right, collecting qualitative feedback, but the meat of it really is around collecting that telemetry and using it to benchmark the experience. And so UEM providers specifically are starting to bring that into their portfolios. There is a kind of a separate third-party market that's focused on this too, but we're starting to see a lot of interest in consolidating both of the two markets together. Still, in my view, separate today, but I think over the next couple of years we'll start to see that come together even more.
Right. I mean, Baramundi is already mentioned also in your latest EUEM report. And as you mentioned, there are in the past two different worlds. It was the monitoring, the desktop monitoring world and the UEM world.
Yep.
And bringing that together, bringing exactly the insights from the endpoint together with the management capabilities of Baramundi is a great advantage for our side. Why? Because then the administrator gets a direct feedback about the changes of configuration, software deployment, patches, and so on, around his work, and gets this feedback and can in real time adopt to the changes and the impact he makes on the endpoints. So this is for us super relevant, and it's a big investment area, and be prepared what we have there in the next time. Coming to the next time, the future. We start our discussion with the current situation that the administrators, IT managers, IT pros are facing. What is your take about the situation of these roles in, let's say, 3 years?
That's a great question, and there are two competing forces here, one of which we've talked about a little bit, the other one we haven't. But one, which we've mentioned a number of times, is increased complexity, a lot of manual work, a lot of pressure from the business, right? Requiring people to change how they approach endpoint management. So that's one piece of the puzzle. The other piece is the labor shortage, right. And skill shortages, specifically when it comes to technical skills. And especially as you have a lot of the more experienced folks that may be very familiar with things like PowerShell scripting, for example, retiring from the workforce, there's going to be even more of a shortage of knowledge and technical expertise when it comes to endpoint management. So organizations are in a tight spot where they're being pressured to deliver more, but they don't have enough resources to actually meet the demand that the business and customers and employees are putting on them. And so what does that mean? One is we're going to need to have a lot more automation throughout the endpoint management stack. So we've talked about that a number of times, and because that automation is going to take away a lot of that low-level manual work that a lot of these folks have traditionally been focused on, it's going to require people to transition their skills. So if you look 3 years from now, I see basically two fundamental paths for what we know now as the endpoint administrator. One would be a much more security-focused role, so someone that has more day-to-day involvement with things like vulnerability management or EDR or other security concepts. Even taking on more of a developer-centric type of mentality to endpoint management. One of the really interesting things we're hearing about today is will endpoint management eventually start to become part of that CI/CD pipeline? In other words, taking a much more agile DevOps approach to delivering this, and that's going to require some developer skills. So you have this one path which is security, developer focused over here, and those are the people that love the technical skills, want to continue that. But we also know a lot of people don't necessarily want to go down that path. They want to be engaging with employees, talking to them, figuring out their needs. And so there is an equally important, but maybe a little bit less tangible career path, which is around what we're calling digital employee experience teams. Someone that's specifically involved with developing empathy for the user, designing new solutions, interviewing people, collecting survey feedback, and is much more people-centric. And we think that that's going to become increasingly common in today's enterprise. And actually, we've just completed some research on that recently, in which we found a lot of former endpoint admins as well as service desk admins filling that digital employee experience team member role. So I think what we're going to see is an up-leveling of skill sets overall, but in different capacities. One technical, one a little bit less technical and more people focused. So there's going to be a lot of changes over the next 3 years, and I think a lot of this has been accelerated by the pandemic. So we'll see how it turns out, but that's my view for the next 3 years.
Wow. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you very much for this insightful discussion. And thank you for listening to our webcast, and hopefully you get also some insights from our discussion. Stay healthy, stay peaceful, stay safe. Thank you very much.